Dakota now. 3 fouls to only 1. Quinn goal! Brian Quinn from Broncos Dakota on the restart. All year long we have talked about how dangerous those restarts around the box can be. Perfect example, Bill, right there.
And Segota with such great vision and perfect pace on the ball, laying it beautifully on the boot of Brian Quinn, who buries it into the upper corner. Look at Segota just to the far part of the wall, and it looked like the defense shied a little bit away on the shot by Brian Quinn.
Welcome to our Soccer's Overtime podcast, and we're taking it a slightly different turn here as we continue through our quarantine summer. We've been enjoying our best of series, and now it's time to talk to some of the true legends of our team, our club, and our sport. We begin by heading on over to USD. Let's welcome in the head coach of the men's soccer club, and we just know him as the Mighty Quinn, number 14. Brian Quinn is our first guest on our Legend series. Brian, thank you so much. I know time is precious these days. Thank you for the time.
Thanks for that wonderful introduction, Craig. Yeah, glad to be there.
I got to ask you right before we even get into, and we've got a lot of stuff to get into, just last night down there in the bowl at Torero Stadium, your son was running around wearing the number 14 for Orange County Soccer Club, playing Landon Donovan's boys, San Diego Loyal. I know the result wasn't the one that your son preferred. He got a better of the Loyal and got a big kick and goal against them the last time they met. How exciting is it for you to maybe just look out your window and be able to see your son playing down there?
Craig, it's enjoyable for a number of reasons. One is because he's got a passion for the game, I had, and I think as a family, all my kids played. And then I think that I enjoy his growth in the game, when he ended up playing at Akron for 3 years, and then he kind of got into USL, has been there for 6 years now with different clubs. And I think year by year, he's got better. And then along with that, I enjoyed what the Loyal have done and what they've brought here to Torero Stadium. And I'm fortunate that fans aren't allowed in to watch the games, but the quality's really, really good.
And in fact, one of your formal charges, Miguel Berry, has come in and bagged a brace 2 matches back.
Yeah, and Miguel's been a big plus for them. Kind of took him a couple of games to get himself rolling, but scored 2 goals against the Galaxy and was dangerous last night. He was unfortunate he didn't score again, had one cleared off the line, but he's kind of been a big lift for the Loyal in the last 3-4 games.
So we've got, like I mentioned, a lot to cover. I started right there in present ground. I'm going to take you a little bit in the Wayback Machine, back to your career as well, and back to growing up in Ireland. You moved to the United States initially to play NASL with Los Angeles Lasers back 1981. And my first question is, what was it that initially drove you? You had a training clip with Everton to leave that part of the world and to come to the United States to play.
That's a great question, Craig. And when I reflect back, I don't really know why. I was probably based upon. I had a mentor, a guy called Brian Halliday, who was out here in California and involved in the NASL and knew the coaching staff and the management that it was the Aztecs, Los Angeles Aztecs. And he asked me would I be interested. And, I was coming up to my 21st birthday. I was married, had a small daughter, and thought, why not? And I came out and I liked the lifestyle right away. Obviously, having traveled around America since I've been here, we all realize how special California is. And I liked it from the beginning. And I think what was important to me was the opportunity to play right away. It was a different style of play. The coach was Brazilian, got Argentinian players, Mexican players, Brazilian players, a couple of Yugoslavian players, American players, Canadian players. So it was a real mix of different cultures playing in one team. And I think for me, I fitted in. My style was a little bit different coming from the background where I grew up playing. I was gritty. I was winning the ball, and all those guys were full of skill and flair. And I just won the ball and gave it to those guys, and that was my role.
How would you compare the NASL at that time in the early 1980s to either MLS, USL Championship. Where would you peg the level of the league at that time?
There was lots and lots of great international players, played in the NSL. And, you look at guys like Kaz Dana and Franz Beckenbauer, who were, in 1994 in the World Cup, were like the first and third top players in the world. And then obviously a little bit older, but still played in the NSL. There was Tifilio Cabillas, who played for Peru. Pele had a little go. Then Johan Neeskens. There was a couple of great players from Paraguay. Julio Cesar Romero and Roberto Cabañas. There was fabulous players. And I think that, there was a spell in the NSL where the level was phenomenal. And then obviously over the years, teams were dissipating, and it became less of a go-to league. But I think what MLS has done, and this is probably more recently in the last 5 to 7 years, they've kind of upgraded the rosters all the way through, where I think in the past where you'd had a good starting group and maybe 1 or 2 good subs, I think now in MLS, the rosters are stronger. And I also think what has helped that has been the growth of the USL, because that's a really good level. And I believe that there's lots of players, a number of players that I'm aware of could easily step in from USL and contribute with MLS teams.
That's a perfect answer to kind of let people get that perspective, because I think there's always this discussion of, well, it was this back in the day and it is this these days. And really, there can be some comparison, but we need to talk to the right guys like yourself who have seen it all. Now, at what point, understanding it, the NASL at that time was running outdoor and indoor, at what point did you first encounter or be recruited to play indoor, the path that eventually led you here for the 83-84 indoor season?
Well, what happened, Craig, was that the NASL, really didn't have a great interest in the indoor game initially, because, the Major Indoor Soccer League was growing and thriving, whatever. And the NASL felt that to keep their players taking over and playing, they created NASL League in I think 1981-82 season. So I ended up playing a little bit for Montreal after I left Los Angeles, played in Montreal. And then the following year played for Montreal again in the indoor league. But it didn't have the seriousness of, the MISL. So when I then ended up in San Diego for that initial year for me for 83-84, the Soccers had really embraced the indoor game. They had 2 championships under their belt. That kind of, had a style with good crowds and fantastic knowledge of how the game was supposed to be played. And so I was starting along with Kevin Crowe and, Hugo Perez, I believe. And we were kind of like new to that kind of level, but got integrated within the team, and then ended up, being part of that 3rd championship, and kind of enjoyed every minute of it. I think that, San Diego embraced the game, but I think that when you went to the sports arena and it was a vibrant and raucous crowd, we all loved it.
Absolutely. And we could see in those early days, and people now talk about it to the point of mythologizing it, mythologization, that, back then, 10,000 people in the crowd, 11,000 people in the crowd. And you would see the average attendance for the MISL, and especially at its heyday, was in the high 7,000s, early 8,000s. My question about that to you, my friend, what do you think it was for the casual fan that attracted them to the sport of indoor soccer at that time? I think that's one of the biggest issues we've had in present day, is how to get the casual fan to embrace the sport of indoor soccer. Why do you think it took in the early 80s the way it did?
I think it was probably 3 main parts, Craig. First of all, the level of play was really, really good. All those guys we talked about in the NASL who had been playing outdoor and then gravitated indoor, like Granitza, Marhetic, Julie V, Kaz Dana, just really, really good players. So the level was really, really good. So the indoor game also afforded fans to come and be engaged in the game, because there was always something happening. You know, it was a goal, an assist, a great save, a counter attack, and the part of that I'm saying that we're engaged with, you know, it was an event where the fans could be involved, and I think that part of it in regard to the marketing was fantastic, because it kind of kept the people engaged in regards to each quarter. There'd be something going on, halftime there'd be something going on, and then at the end of the game, you know, the involvement of the players with the fans and the interaction, and then also within the community. I think that was a big part of it. So there was a number of those factors where the players were great, the fans were engaged in the game, and I think in a broader spectrum, the players were out and kind of helping out within the community all the time.
You know, there's something else that occurs to me as I do my research, which was that the sport of indoor soccer came at a time in American broadcast television history where cable networks were just being created, as in ESPN, I believe, began in 1979, just around the same time as the beginning of MISL. USA Network at one point had a national deal for indoor soccer, and later on, of course, the Prime Ticket Network did. And these were all at a point where cable was becoming a part, you know, becoming a thing in U.S. broadcasting and U.S. homes, and as such, those networks needed content. You know, nowadays they've got the NFL, they've got the NBA or Major League Baseball, but back then they needed some sports to cover.
No, that's a great point, and we always tease guys that covered the indoor game, like Bill McDonald. We said we made Bill McDonald. We keep saying that we made Bill McDonald. And the other part was that, you know, in San Diego, as you know, Craig, having lived here a long time, is when you win, you garner a lot of coverage. And we had beat writers. You know, we had the two newspapers at the time. We had the San Diego Union, then we had the Tribune in the afternoon with Rick Davis, who was fantastic. He traveled with the team, and then at various times we had Tom Krasavic, and then Brian Brown, and then Rick Bucher, who covered the Sockers, you know, as their first gigs as sports reporters, and it was important to the people in San Diego, and I think that the game itself was attractive, and there was that little window, I think, between 1982 to 1991, where it had great relevance in soccer throughout the country, because there was really no professional league at all.
Yeah, I was watching a halftime interview that Randy Hahn did in 1986 with the beat writer, or the man who covered MISL for USA Today. And he was there saying, well, yeah, we believe at USA Today, you know, MISL, that's a major sport. It's one we need to cover. And they were there for a regular season soccer sidekicks game.
There you go.
You know, and what a difference, you know, in terms of just that perception. Whereas today, if someone from USA Today came, I think Phil would send him a limousine.
Yeah.
Okay. Along those lines, when you arrived a year later, the Big Z came to San Diego, and you had a chance to play with Steve Jungle. One of my biggest takeaways as a lifelong fan of this game, who's now really reincorporating these old games that happened when I was a high school kid, not living here, didn't know the Sockers, is just the greatness of Steve Jungle. You know, his nickname, the Lord of All Indoors, absolutely applies. It's almost egregious to me he hasn't had his number retired, because I think a lot of people don't recognize, and that's why I'm leading to a question. How truly special and different was he? How apparent was it when you took the floor with him?
I think that Steve's number's probably not retired at the Sockers because he wasn't with us a long time. That's the only reason, Craig, because you know, he'd come from San Jose, having previously played with the New York Arrows, and then ended up going to Tacoma. And, you know, you can debate, was he the best indoor player ever? I mean, that's certainly debatable. I don't think it's debatable that he was the best goal scorer ever. I mean, unbelievable knack for scoring goals that nobody else could score. And this obsession about getting in the right place and being brave and being tough, and every part of his body, and thrived on scoring goals. Maybe didn't have the flamboyance and the technical aplomb of Julie V, but as a guy for scoring goals, unmatched in the history of the game.
And the other guy who I feel gets second bananaed way too much in terms of the memories of soccer fans, which is why I want to bring him up, is Broncos Dakota, the man who won between his New York and San Diego career 9 championships, and was regularly like the number 2 player on the Sockers every year that would have been a number 1 on like literally every other team.
Absolutely correct, Craig. I mean, probably the most talented player that was in the indoor game. I'm not going to say the best player, because I always have this fondness for Kaz Dana, because he was at like a little bit different level where he played and what he done. Julie with all his tricks, and Jungle with the goals. But Bronco had all the tools in regards to scoring goals, seeing the game, strength, right foot, left foot, kind of unorthodox, creative. And, having played with him for a number of years, he's right up there in that top echelon of indoor soccer players ever. I don't mean just for the Sockers, I'm saying ever. When it was great to be around him.
Now, as you grew through your incredible career with the San Diego Sockers, going from being a defensive spark plug and a guy in the midfield that would stir things up, to eventually rising to leadership levels, and of course, as some of those great players we're talking about aged out, you kind of started to become the older man on hand, but you also had an involvement in player leadership from the business side of the sport, players union and whatnot. And I wanted to ask you about that as well, because as I mentioned, I think there's a lot of mythologizing that's done about the 1980s. And in particular, when I researched, as again, a guy who grew up high school up in the LA area, didn't have the coverage of this. And I researched, why did the Sockers trade Steve Jungle, right? Steve Jungle traded to Tacoma, and it was for $200,000. And the LA Times story, which at the time quoted yourself and quoted Bob Bell, Bell spoke of the Sockers as a, quote, struggling league and a struggling team and a struggling league and a struggling sport. Those were his quoted words as to why they sold the best player in the league at his prime to a division rival for money. Just to kind of get into that part of the conversation, what was the talk amongst players at the time of the health, business-wise, of the MISL?
I think the first thing is we never seen any of that 200,000. I can tell you that. I think that, Craig, there was this sense of, there were certain franchises doing well, I mean, ourselves included, and then there were other franchises throughout the league who would struggle, where their attendance would be 1,500, 2,000, and it wasn't sustainable. So I think that there was this initiative that came into being where there never was a salary cap initially. When Steve Jungle and Broncos Dakota and Fernando Clavillo, rest in peace, that came to the Sockers, there wasn't really a salary cap. So I think what happened then, people were the ownership, they started talking about, well, if we're going to sustain this league, or if we're going to make it work for everybody across the country, there has to be I think the term they used at that time was economies of scale, where everyone had to be on an even playing field. Yeah. And so I think that was the introduction of the first salary cap, and it may have been, 1.85 or $2 million initially, something around those numbers. And what happened was that year after year, when they had the Board of Governors meetings, our ownership meetings, the salary cap was always getting introduced and getting lowered and lowered and lowered. And I think that Bob probably recognized, said, well, if I can make money from my investment at this time and kind of stop the bleeding, so to speak, then that's what he done. And, it was a big loss for us, obviously, and Tacoma thrived for 2 or 3 years, and with Steve and Pracky at that time. had done a fantastic job. I think they got to the final where they did lose against Dallas and one of the off years that we had. But I think it was purely financial for Bob, and then also to fit within the current salary structures that were going to be forthcoming down the line, where you couldn't have all those great players on one team.
Did you feel that there were many teams that overextended themselves during the course of the MISL? In other words, like you mentioned, there's that 3 or 4 banner franchise group, but then were these teams down here in the second tier, were they regularly overextending themselves and then having to fold? Was that the reason?
I think they felt there was iniquity there, Craig, in regards to, you know, it's the same in all sports, right, wrong, or indifferent. You know, it's the Yankees or Dodgers in baseball. You know, if it's, you know, the Real Madrids, Barcelonas, Manchester United, Chelsea's, and in soccer, you know, worldwide, there's always these premier clubs with fantastic resources. And so you just have to live with that. And, you know, I think the introduction of the salary cap in hindsight didn't really help grow the sport. Yeah. You know, I think it hindered it. Maybe what we should have done was let's kind of increase it and market it more and try and make it work. And the reduction of salary cap, I think it's, you know, when you start getting into cases where players were thinking, you know, is this what I want to do? Or is it better I start getting on with my life and get a real job and have a career? I think that impacted the sport a little bit.
That's fascinating to me. Now, you had the opportunity, of course, as the MSL folded, and then the CISL came into being to continue with the Soccers and to move into that coaching position for the Soccers. How did your perspective change from being a key player and a player leader to then moving to that management side and coaching side?
I think, you know, and I had that little interim spell, Craig, where I was kind of away from the game as I went and played outdoor, right, you know, from 91 through 94. So after Ron left to become head coach of Kansas City in MLS, the opening for the Soccers arrived, and at that time, you may or may not recall, the ownership was Ron Hahn, right, and the Hahn family. So I interviewed for the job, and I think that the CISL conceptually was a really, really good idea because, you know, it utilized sports arenas that weren't being used in the summer, but it was outside the soccer season in regards to drawing fans and creating the, you know, the tradition that had been indoor soccer. So it had some pluses, but I think that was the biggest drawback, you know, especially for us in San Diego. I mean, how do you try and get back to that 7,000-8,000 average attendance in the summer? Yeah. When there's so many things to do here in San Diego. But having said that, it did create new franchises across the country where some teams thrived. I think Portland thrived, and I think Houston thrived, and there was a few other franchises. But I don't think it was particularly helpful for the Soccers.
Now, the elephant in the room is MLS, which, you know, wasn't in being during the prime of your career, and came into being, you know, in the mid 90s, and, you know, for guys like Paul Wright, Sean Bowers, you know, it was a transition at Preki from indoor to outdoor. Have you ever thought about if you were coming up in your son Aiden's time, instead, basically if you were flipped, if you would have never seen the indoor arena or seen the indoor game at all because you would have had a more robust outdoor playing opportunity?
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, I mean, I do think that, you know, those years where there wasn't an outdoor league, you know, the reality is you improve year by year by becoming a good pro and finding better habits. I think what happened with MLS, when it came in to being in 96, it kind of did become the elite soccer league in the country, right off the bat because of the players that it brought, number one, because of the attention that it created. And there was only, I believe, 10 franchises at the beginning, but they did make a big splash. And to be fair, there was probably a few years where the MLS, in essence, where it was propped up by the Crafts and the Hunts and Phil Anschutz, where it was close to going out of business, but they stuck with it. And I think, you know, in the last 10 years, it's thrived immeasurably beyond anyone's expectations.
Absolutely. I've got just two more things that I wanted to run by you. One, again, looking back, and then the last one looking forward. One of the things that has fascinated me watching all of these great games from the early and mid 80s is to see the evolution of the indoor game in terms of its rules. Yeah. And how Zoltan Toth made a living on defensive passbacks, on guys being 3 feet away from him and tipping the ball to him, and he picks it up, and or you guys running fly patterns down the wall, and he's trying to hit the guy on the left wing or hit the guy on the right wing, and if it doesn't work, you just send it back to him. Boom, throw it again. That's out of the game now. The goalie throw is still there, but the passback is gone. 6 fouls came in, then 6 fouls went away. My question is, what rules do you think? And then you saw CISL in the evolution. Do you think the sport has always evolved in the right direction, or do you think some of those rules from the early 80s made for a more pleasant viewing experience?
I think the pass back to the goalkeeper where he can lift it out was kind of a precursor to what the indoor game kind of the outdoor game took upon itself, where they done away with the back passes where the goalkeeper had to start using their feet. So that was, you know, a rule indoor created and then outdoor kind of adapted, so to speak, Craig. I think that what happened was there became a lot more insight into how to play with patterns in the mid to late 90s, early 2000s, where I think a lot of coaches started looking at basketball as part and parcel of coaching theories, and, you know, timing and running and patterns and kind of, you know, shifting defenders over. I think back when I played, we had a lot more off the cuff play and individual players who could beat you one-on-one. But today, I think what it's done is the game is still exciting. There's lots and lots of chances all the time, and I think what hasn't changed, the key players are the key players. The Craig Childs scoring goals are always going to be the key players, and Boris Prado in the goal is always going to be a key player. That hasn't changed. And if you look back at, you know, a little bit of our history, Ron was magnificent, where he always had 2 goalkeepers that were capable of stepping in and had them, you know, I'm not going to say on edge, but managed them fantastically well. So they both kind of received enough games and always seemed to come through for us. And then we also had great attacking prowess going forward from midfield and forwards.
Yeah, it was complete teams. That's one thing I always notice, is there's a guy for every role, and that even continued into the early 90s and into your time as well. Now, last thing I wanted to ask you, MASL today is a sport that obviously is now a niche sport in our country. And as we discussed over this great conversation, not only is MLS at its highest point now in terms of talent and level of play, but now USL Championship, USL League One. You know, there's a pyramid here in American soccer, and MASL is trying to find their spot in that soccer ecosystem. One thing I've been trying since I've rejoined the Soccers is to see how, instead of being outside the ecosystem or adjacent to it, how can we get inside? And kind of just an open-ended question to close out our discussion here is, what advice you would have for Major Arena Soccer League? Is it trying to partner more with USL Championship franchises? Is it trying to create bridges where you have outdoor-indoor teams playing year-round? Is it trying to go to second leagues in internationally more than they are doing now, and trying to find those young Brian Quinns that maybe are out there. What advice would you have for MASL to try and take a step up?
It's a really, really in-depth question, Craig, with a lot of tentacles to it, in respect to, you know, how to enhance the game, how to grow the game, how to develop the game. So there's a lot involved in that question. My initial thought was, when you look back and the success that we had with the Soccers, what I remember was we also had a very, very, very good second team. We had a reserve team that Ron nurtured with Eric Geyer, and I think at times afterwards with Ron's son Guy, who was a coach of the Soccers reserve, so to speak. I think that aspect of the sport could enhance the game, because you do continually need to have people filtering into the top level. I think the unfortunate part was when FIFA decided that futsal was going to be the international game for, you know, countries around the world. That inhibited the growth of, you know, indoor/arena soccer, because, you know, if FIFA had endorsed Major Indoor Soccer League, MASL, as the world's game, it would have taken off immeasurably across the world. You know, I mean, there's good players in Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, in Europe, you know, the Middle East. There's fantastic players. So that part of it was hindered by what FIFA done. And I think that probably looking to grow the game would be find a way to develop, you know, youth players in a system that feeds into MASL, number one. And then secondly, if I was Phil and Ed Hale and the guys in Major Arena Soccer League, I would look to explore the possibility of expanding the league to another country, where you can say, well, where would you like to go and play indoor soccer? Would it be England? Would it be Spain? Would it be Hungary? Where you have facilities where they play ice hockey. And if you play ice hockey, you can play indoor soccer.
Brian, I really appreciate it. You've been very generous with your time with all our great Soccers fans. Thank you for kicking off our Legends interview series here, and best of luck as you get ready to bring the boys out on the pitch there at USD. Thanks again.
Much appreciated, Craig. Thank you.